Coming to our speaker today, Gary Hampson. He's a professor of sedimentary geology in the Department of Earth Science and Engineering at Imperial College London. He teaches and researches sedimentology, sequence stratigraphy, and its applications to the characterization of rocks and fluid flow in subsurface for geoenergy. Gary's research is grounded in the insights provided by outcrop geology, but he's advocate for collaborative cross-disciplinary research that integrates different data types and analytical approaches. With that, I would like to invite Gary to the stage, and
thanks very much, Artem and EAGE, and welcome to Imperial College. I mean, we're still getting used to having in-person events as well. We only really had certainly really felt like being back to kind of normal work in the last few months, really. So it's great to have the EAGE local chapter here again. So my background is a sedimentary geologist. What I'm going to talk about here goes way beyond sedimentary geology. So some bits of this I'm drawing on my colleagues' expertise. But what I'm going to show you is basically it's a combination of geological characterization, reservoir modelling, and doing that in a way basically allows us to build lots of models in a fast and efficient way. And we're really sort of looking to try and unravel what are the aspects of the geology which will influence flow of CO2 with a view to sort of characterizing storage sites and finding out where we should be putting our effort. So there's lots of names there. This has been a kind of a big collaborative effort that I'm going to talk about. So the three different groups involved. So at Imperial College, there's myself, Kar Jakaman, Matt Jackson, Shakwat Hossain, who's a PhD student in the audience, Jafar Al-Shakri and Will Jackson. So they were both MSc students here doing the Petroleum Geoscience MSc, and they finished that, I guess, about 15 months ago now. Then at TU Delft, we have Sebastian Geiger and Dima Petrovsky. Calgary, we've got Julio Mercado Silva, Cecilio Giudice, Fazila Rahman, and Mario Costa Sousa. So there's a combination of names there of geologists, reservoir engineers, and computer scientists. Okay, so the rationale here, and really this kind of serves as an outline for the talk. We know that sedimentological heterogeneity occurs across lots of scales. We know that it can be important in dispersing CO2. What we don't necessarily know is how much of that heterogeneity we really need to characterize and to sort of include in models of CO2 subsurface flow. And we don't necessarily have a good handle on which heterogeneities we can afford to maybe not ignore, but spend less effort and time characterizing. So what I'm going to show here basically is sort of a method that we sort of put together that basically uses a combination of three different sort of key components. So one of them experimental design to essentially investigate the effects of a large number of heterogeneities with a relatively small number of models. Secondly, building those models quickly and effectively using a sketch-based tool, which basically allows us to build lots of models quickly, but in a way that doesn't rely on lots of specialist input, but we can use as the tool as geologists rather than as specialist reservoir models. And the third part is flow diagnostics. These again sort of rapid calculations that approximate aspects of the flow. And again, we make some assumptions and simplifications there, but they again allow us to get very rapidly an idea of what might be important for flow. We illustrate that with two examples. So Sherwood sandstone and Bunter sandstone. So these are Triassic fluvial sandstones, which around the UK onshore and offshore are the sort of the best candidates for subsurface storage of CO2 and lots of other fluids as well. And the second example, using data from the Johansen and Cook formations. So this is basically offshore Norway, the Northern Lights project. And I should say there that most of what I'm going to present in those two case studies, well, everything from those two case studies was done by Jafar and Will, the two MSc students. And what I show you will basically be 3 months of work on their part, and they weren't expert modelers when they started this work. Then I'll finish it by giving a few kind of indications of where this work is going in the future and how it will develop. So maybe to begin with, so the top left there, you've got an image which is often kind of shown to illustrate different types of trapping of CO2 in the subsurface. So the key thing here is there's 4 different types of trapping. There's stratigraphic and structural trapping that basically rely on sort of the buoyancy of the injected CO2, and you know that trapping style is what we're familiar with in terms of oil and gas reservoirs. But then we have additional trapping mechanisms, including residual or capillary trapping, solubility trapping, and mineral trapping. So those are all aspects of trapping CO2 which are specific to carbon sequestration and that we haven't really thought about in the context of oil and gas. And, you know, maybe to illustrate those, we inject CO2 into a reservoir, it moves under buoyancy towards the top of the structure. Well, we're kind of used to that style of trapping. As the plume moves up, some of that CO2 is trapped in the pore space by capillary trapping, or referred to as residual trapping on this diagram. Some of that CO2, again, through time, will dissolve into the pore waters. And also, as that happens, there's also the brine, the CO2-rich brine, becomes more dense, and it sort of fingers down. And eventually, you know, if the CO2 is dissolved within the pore waters for long enough and in sufficient concentrations, and the mineralogy of the sand grains or the detrital grains in there is conducive to it, then some of that CO2 will be trapped in the form of minerals, mineral precipitation. So basically, you know, there's a lot of sedimentological characterization that could affect all of those different processes. We know that sedimentological heterogeneity and other forms of geological heterogeneity influence fluid flow and recovery. It's sort of what's the basic tenet of oil and gas reservoir characterization. But, you know, in terms of taking that into CO2, well, there's different fluid properties, different trapping mechanisms over a much wider range of lengths, of time scales. And it's pretty fair to say that as yet we've only really begun to scratch the surface about, you know, how the geology might interact with those different trapping mechanisms. From a point of view of trying to model some of these processes, you know, more processes, more complex physics and chemistry. Okay, that equates to more computational expense, longer time scales, also potentially more computational expense. So, you know, the modelling effort required to try and capture all of these things is potentially much more than what we're used to thinking about in terms of predicting oil and gas production. So just to sort of illustrate, you know, a couple of illustrations about how we could sort of demonstrate that heterogeneity does influence CO2 migration. So the images at the top there are a series of sort of time-lapse images. The top row basically showing a cross-section up here. So just after injection on the left to several years after injection on the right. And the bottom, sort of mid row in there is showing the same data, but basically in map view at one of the reservoir levels. And these are taken from monitoring of the CO2 plume in the Sleipner field. And, you know, you get a sense in the cross section here that, you know, the CO2 plume, as indicated by these sort of high amplitude reflectors in here, it's not moving out from the injection well here in a uniform way. You know, there's sort of indications potentially of, you know, sort of barriers to vertical flow. Some areas here, the fluids are moving out faster than in others. And in map view, you know, the plume is not moving out in a radial fashion. It's being steered by, in this case, sand body distribution within this reservoir. This bottom image here is basically showing sort of the output of some numerical simulations. So here we're basically showing a pressure field at the top, but the key thing is these two diagrams here. So we're looking at a cross section. We're injecting CO2 onto this side of the model. We're producing it here. This bottom image here, basically the capillary effects within the reservoir are kind of uniform there. So effectively the same rel-perm curve and all the rocks within that lower model. And this modelling here, there's heterogeneity in the capillary properties. And the model with heterogeneity basically get breakthrough at this side of the model about twice as fast as we do in this more homogeneous model. So there's, some indications also from core flood experiments that actually this capillary trapping could kind of accentuate some of the variations in sweep that we're used to seeing in oil and gas reservoirs. Okay, and now this diagram here, again, this is something, all of us working with the subsurface are pretty used to. The vertical axis here is basically sort of coverage of data. So what proportion of our reservoir unit we resolve with the data, and the scale of measurements on the horizontal axis here. So cores, lots of detail, but we hardly sample any of the reservoir. Well logs, we sample a bit more of the reservoir, still not very much. Still, at very specific locations. Seismic data, we sample the whole reservoir, but at a relatively coarse resolution. So we're used to basically having sparse data, potentially biased data, and sort of integrating those different data types together. And these are problems which are likely to become more acute for CO2 storage. If we're storing CO2 in depleted oil and gas reservoirs, we've got a history of how those reservoirs behaved when we were producing hydrocarbons. We know kind of how the fluids are plumbed within those reservoirs. If we're talking about saline aquifers, so injecting CO2 into effectively sort of virgin rocks in terms of our subsurface knowledge, we're going to be doing that with a much smaller number of wells we would use to extract oil and gas. So these issues about data coverage and sparseness become much more acute. So part of this, well, if you want to understand geological heterogeneity with sparse data, drawing on analogues is pretty important. So this diagram on the left is a series of cartoons from big scale to small scale, trying to show how at different scales we can link together our observations of geological heterogeneity. And I'm not going to talk in too much detail about that, but outcrops have value in being able to see the big scale, link that to progressively smaller scales, and see how everything sort of fits together in 3 dimensions. So there's still plenty of life in terms of geological characterization and applying that to CO2 storage. And here's some examples. These are data on the left taken from the Northern Lights project. So seismic data. In this case, the storage unit is showing these yellow and orange colours in here. You probably can't see it, given the scale of section there, but there's a series of dipping reflectors within each of the yellow and the orange units, indicating sort of a cliniform set within each of those packages. There's also an overlying in blue. That's the main sort of reservoir unit in the control field. Kind of slightly in a slightly different location to where the storage site is. In this case, we have this one well that was cored, which has been cored into the storage site as a sort of a test well, but potentially that will be an injection well. There's one more well planned, and that's it in terms of that storage unit in the storage area. So again, kind of sparse data. Sort of 2 opposing depositional models, both shallow marine systems, but lots of uncertainty because of the sparse data coverage. So lots of aspects of the geology are sort of poorly constrained. And then in this case, this is a set of cartoons from big scale to small scale that Will developed when he was trying to interpret this data, and I'll come back and show you those later on in a bit more depth. Hopefully I've kind of made the case for the value of sedimentological and geological characterization, why it's going to be important for CO2 storage. Okay, so next sort of onto this method. Having acknowledged that, what can we do about it? So the method that we've used in Will and Jafar's projects, and that we're going to sort of develop in future, has 3 key elements. So the first is experimental design. That's a fairly kind of established tool, been used in lots of reservoir modelling projects in the past. So this table here, again, the detail is not important, but each row in here is one parameter, one heterogeneity, for example, that we're interested in investigating. And in this case, we've got 8 different heterogeneities, 8 of these rows. Each column is a one model. In this case, there's 32 columns, and each of the cells in those columns is either high or low. So basically here, with this particular experimental design, each model either has 8 heterogeneities that kind of represented within it, and those either have a high setting or a low setting. So for example, that could be sand bodies are large or small of a particular type. And using a new experimental design approach, where we sort of mix and match these parameters according to the experimental design sort of captured in this table here, we can sort of rank the effects of those 8 parameters just using 32 models. So it basically minimizes the amount of modeling time we need to sort of get that kind of ranking. Now, of course, you don't get something for nothing. So a relatively small number of models, we can identify and rank the key parameters. What we don't really get a chance to look at is the interaction between those parameters. So this works as a sort of a first pass screening tool, but if you want to go into more detail and kind of further study, that requires building more models which are sort of more bespoke to a particular problem. Okay, now the second aspect here is this sketch-based modelling approach. So, I mean, this is part of a sort of a related research project that's been ongoing for almost 10 years, and kind of grew out of modelling for oil and gas reservoirs. But the key thing here is that building reservoir models is really become a very kind of specialist tool, and often there's being able to sort of convert the geological concepts into a model. Again, requires kind of in-depth knowledge of the software, a certain amount of black magic in making that software do what you want it to do. And that's a real kind of barrier to entry. So the idea here is to take something which people can learn very quickly. They sketch on a tablet, could sketch over an outcrop photo, a seismic line. We can then generate a 3D model from that, and then sort of interrogate that model. So basically, that was a drive behind developing this modelling tool, and I'll show you a bit more of how that works in the next few slides. But again, the idea is that it's non-specialist. You can easily build models and interrogate them, and really this sort of maximum at the bottom. If you can't draw it, then don't model it. So the idea there is if you don't have a clear idea of the geological concept you're trying to capture in the model, you shouldn't be anywhere near a computer trying to generate a digital model. And the other thing here, this is a prototyping tool. It's not a replacement for Portrayal or GoCAD or Skewer, all those other kind of in-depth tools. But if you look at any other kind of engineering and many science applications, we don't, for example, in this case, we don't start building a car by starting generating thousands of components, putting them together and see what we get. We start off here. We sketch a storyboard, and we build progressively more complex models, and at each stage we sort of narrow our focus and hone in on what's really important. And this sketch-based tool is essentially, will be somewhere near the beginning of this process in here. And sort of the key enabling technology here is basically sketch-based interface and modelling. So this was really developed initially for sort of medical applications. So here you've got 3D model of a heart, basically taken from these sort of 2D strokes on a tablet. We can also take an existing model, so like this one of the hand in here, again a few strokes, and you can see the veins on the back of the hand in there. So this technology has been around for several decades, but not in terms of geoscience. So how does that work? Well, here's kind of what you see as a user, and we've just spent this afternoon with our new MSc students. They spent this afternoon kind of learning to use this software, and tomorrow they're going to be using it in anger for an assessment. So here you've got a sketching window, which is sort of a vertical cross section. The data in here, these are basically 5 wells, essentially. The colours represent different fascies within those wells. We have a map at the bottom, sort of locating those wells, and the 3D view in here. And we can sketch in vertical cross section, different orientations. We can also sketch in map view, and those combined together make us a kind of a 3D model at the bottom left there. And this is an example of those same data, but correlation between the wells. In map view, these different coloured lines represent the boundaries between some of these fascies and different colours in the cross section, for example, as sort of projected into 3D. And this is the full kind of 3D model. And this is something that people can use and generate it in the space of a few minutes to tens of minutes. We can also modify those models quickly. So here's basically sort of a reference model, or different sections to a reference model on the left, with 4 kind of slight variations on that model, with some differences in the geometry and number of channels at particular levels, or the continuity of fascie felts of kind of along the strike of the model, or differences in the sinuosity, straight versus slightly sinuous fascie felts, or sort of wide fascie felts versus narrow fascie felts. So things that might be uncertain within the data. And so we can generate those models pretty quickly. The third part, which again is part of the sketch-based software, but conceptually it's different. Having generated geological models, we then want to be able to measure things from those models, and something which tells us or gives us a sort of a first order picture of flow. And that's this flow diagnostics tool. So again, this isn't something that we've invented. It's been around and developed over the last 10 years by the reservoir engineering community. What we've implemented here, again, is a sort of a quick sort of integrating it into the modeling package. So what you're looking at here is here's a 3D geological model. Here is that model that's showing the pressure field around an injector well. So basically, the blues in here indicate sort of relatively high pressure and increasing pressure towards the reds. So probably in terms of, rather than me just talking about it, it's probably perfect just to sort of show you an example. So this movie here, we're sketching in a cross section. So we sketched a surface. We just projected that into 3D here, just a simple extrapolation in 3D. Now selected the region below here, and we've sort of formed a channel in there, cut down below the red surface. And in map view, we're showing that we've traced a sort of a sinuous trajectory for that channel. We're now going to select this area here and draw a second channel, sort of cut down at the same level. Sketch a different trajectory here on the right, and then that's there, all there in the 3D view. We can then sort of select the region below, then put in another stratigraphic surface. So here that's the surface as it at the front cross section of the model. As we go sort of further back into the model, we have another cross section. We say that surface is at a deeper level, so it's sort of dipping away from us. Then at the back of the model, we sort of bring it back to the surface again. So it's basically has this sort of bowl-shaped geometry cross section. Here we basically just sort of coloured the different regions of those models so we can differentiate them. And that's it, so within basically a couple of minutes, the model's built. But we're now looking at the flow diagnostics. So here's the model. The model, to make the flow calculations, we use a Cartesian grid. Just that makes the maths nice and simple. And we can vary the resolution of the model. Here, so I should say that this movie is in real time, obviously by someone Carl, who knows how to use the software well. But he's doing it faster than I can talk through it, basically. So let me go back again. So here we go to here's the model, okay. So we're now going to sort of see that on the grid where we're making the calculation. So here we've got a coarse resolution. We just type in the resolution so it's higher. That's the higher resolution model. We've got an injector well in red and 3 reducer wells. We're moving them around again in real time. The pressure field is changing in real time as we're doing that. So the calculations are all on the fly. We just use one pressure solve. So essentially it's tracer flow. And again, that keeps the maths nice and simple and fast. There's obviously kind of issues with that, but it's a good first approximation. Here we're looking at time of flight, so how long it takes the flow to move out from the well. And here we're looking at how flow is partitioned between the different wells. So the blue field in here is basically connected, parts of the reservoir fluid is connected to this well or to the red well at the back. So, again, this is a pretty simple tool. There are some assumptions in there, and specifically for CO2, the fact we're looking at tracer flow. So we're kind of ignoring all that complex physics of multi-phase flow and capillary trapping, etc., as things currently stand. Okay, so let me now sort of talk through that method in the context of these two examples. So the first of them is the Sherwood and Bunter sandstones. So in terms of where these are in the UK, there's a big outcrop belt running sort of from northeast coast down through Cheshire and the Midlands down to the south coast. This is the main reservoir in the Wych Farm oil field, and it's also the main reservoir in some of the depleted oil and gas fields in the Liverpool Bay area, which will be used to store CO2 by ENI in the near future. It's also the main storage unit in the Endurance storage site offshore of the northeast. So, it has some sort of direct applications, and potentially it could be used for CO2 storage in many more sites onshore and offshore. So, what is it geologically? Well, it's basically a fluvial sandstone with some aeolian intervals within it, and also some lacustrine mudstones kind of interbedded within it. So this sort of cartoon at the top here is sort of showing the stratigraphy of the Sherwood sandstone or the Bunter sandstone, and then something about its kind of large scale kind of lateral heterogeneity at the scale of, say, one of these reservoirs in here. So the yellow in here, that's basically fluvial sandstones sort of stacked into larger, more continuous bodies. The orange in here is aeolian sandstone. The greens are sort of isolated, poorly connected fluvial sand bodies. The browns are sheet floods, so basically sand deposit outside of those channels when they were in flood. And then the paler blue in here is basically floodplains and mainly mudstones, and then the crystalline mudstones, which have the lowest permeability within this succession. So you get a kind of an idea about the sort of larger scale architecture of the unit. But obviously we can zoom into some of each of these different fascies in here, and we can see more detail. So if you look at these stacked fluvial channels, which are the best reservoir quality, say in the Wych Farm field, then what we see is basically a series of stacked channels, some of which have got carbonate cemented units along their base, so again potentially baffles the flow, and we see a few sort of isolated patches of sort of abandoned muddy channel fills as well. So these are sort of the heterogeneities we think might be important, within this unit. So having kind of identified some of these heterogeneities, we're just sort of listed in here, we have to sort of decide kind of a high setting and a low setting for those. Again, just this is really for the experimental design part. So the settings in here effectively, we have thin and thick layers of the different units, and that those ranges are sort of dictated by what we see at outcropping in the subsurface reservoirs. So they sort of capture the range that we observe there. Whether the aeolian sandstones are continuous or discontinuous. Same for the mudstones. Are they continuous sheets or are they more discontinuous? Basically, something about the proportion of those kind of poorly connected channels in the muddier intervals within the reservoir. Something about the continuity of the more sheet-like sand bodies connected to those poorly connected channel sands, and also some values in here that define sort of the vertical spacing and sort of lateral extent of the carbonate cemented intervals at the base of some of those stacked channels. We've also sort of we assign porosity and permeability. In this case, these are values they're a bit of a kind of an average of values for all of those different locations around the UK. So we're not sort of trying to target any one particular storage site. This is something a bit more generic. I guess the key thing here, though, is our aeolian sandstones have the highest permeability, and about an order of magnitude below that, we have fluvial sandstones. Well, basically all the other sandstones, and we've modelled the floodplain and the crystalline units as basically being more or less impermeable. Okay, so these are some of the examples of the models that Jafar built. So here's the sort of the skeleton of sketch surfaces in one of those models, and here basically the regions in between those surfaces are coloured in by fascies. So one thing in here, you know, we're not trying to model the whole reservoir or whole storage unit. We had to make some decisions about, you know, what heterogeneity we represent, and you know that sort of determines to some extent the areal scale and the thickness that we can capture. Although we could build models across different scales and link them together. So in this case, we just modeled something which is pretty much close to an interwell spacing in say one of the depleted oil and gas fields in Liverpool Bay. These three models at the bottom just show, you know, some of that suite of 32 models in the experimental design. We just picked out some to sort of highlight the key differences between them. So, you know, thick layers versus thin layers, laterally continuous aeolian sandstones versus sort of more lens-like distributions of aeolian sandstone. And we sort of cut away some of the fluvial sandstone so you can see the orange colours in there. Discontinuous lake, so basically in this model they're kind of at the edge of the lake versus continuous. And then in these intervals of sort of poorly connected fluvial channels, sheet sand and mudstones, we sort of play around a bit with the extent and the connectivity of the various sand bodies. So what do we get out from that in terms of the results of the flow diagnostics? So in this case, you know, these models were built using the software as it was about 15 months ago. And this is, on the left here, we've got a ranking of those different heterogeneities we looked at. In basically X direction, so that's sort of west-east or Y direction or south. And in this case, you can see there's only really one heterogeneity that matters for lateral flow, and that's the lateral extent of those high permeability aeolian sandstones. If they're sheets or lenses, that's the key thing. Nothing else is really important. If you look at the vertical permeability, well, other things come into play. So here we have the extent of those crystalline mudstones. There's no surprise there if you have a laterally continuous impermeable layer versus something which is less continuous. The thickness of those layers, and that thickness in this case, you know, thin layers, there's many more of them. So if you have more of those mudstone layers, they have a bigger impact. Also, some of the parameters that describe the spacing and distribution of those cemented lags, so basically baffles within the major fluvial sandstone units, those are also sort of important within this in terms of vertical permeability. And as a sort of a proxy for sort of well, not really trapping potential, but for the potential for these heterogeneities to sort of baffle the flow, we basically put an injection well and a production well on either side of the model, and we looked at how long it took for that tracer flow effectively to move through the model and break through the producer or offtake well. And this is what these are sort of the tornado charts showing those results there. So again, the most important things are sort of lateral continuity of the aeolian sandstones are our most permeable sandstones. The lateral continuity of the crystalline mudstones, for example, as well. And then the thickness of the layers and sort of the arrangement of and actually, maybe the thickness of the layers as well. These parameters here will have some effect, but relatively small. So in this case here, this is a nice sort of clear result that basically we can really pick out 2 or 3 heterogeneities that really make a big difference. That's where you want to focus sort of your attention in terms of collecting more data and/or trying to represent them in more detailed models. Just to sort of give you an idea of, model basically where we have discontinuous aeolian sandstone, so that's this model here at the top left, and then we sort of taken away most of the fascists just to show in more detail the distribution of the aeolian sandstones. And here's our injector well. You can see that the tracer flow is moving pretty fast through these orange high perm units, sort of raced across to this well on the other side, and we're still just sort of gradually getting in contact with these other fascists, including the relatively good fluvial sandstones. Okay, so that's sort of one story which gives us quite a nice simple picture. And there's a bit of a contrast with this second case study or second example on the shallow marine Johansen and Cook formations. So this 3D sort of block diagram is showing effectively a sort of a pseudo sort of seismic view of the subsurface beneath the troll field, and then just to the south of that, the Northern Lights sort of storage site. Here's the well, which is the test well where the core comes from. Blue in here, that's the main reservoir unit within the troll field, and the deeper orange and yellow units, that's the main CO2 storage unit. And we'll sort of develop this sort of conceptual cartoon, basically, of from large scale to small scale of heterogeneity within these units. And again, there's very sparse data, so we drew pretty heavily on the overlying troll field reservoir, much more data there, and based on the data which is available, it looks to be a pretty close match sedimentologically. So at this scale, we have in map view, we have a delta building out from east to west, although there's some ambiguity about whether that delta has a nice kind of simple bulge in the shoreline or it has a more complex geometry. That's kind of unresolved, I would say, within the data that's available. If we're looking at cross section through there, basically we see there are three kind of tones of prograding sort of delta units separated by more extensive shales. Again, there's sort of other interpretations are possible, but we didn't investigate those within Will's study. We look at each of those deltaic units, then we can see cliniforms, and we can image those in parts of the seismic data. We see that in the core they have carbonate cement along them, and sort of interfingering of fascies along them, sort of based on analog data from the troll field and outcrops as well. At even smaller scale, we can see that some of these fascies are cross-bedded. Some of them there's mud drapes along the cross-beds that might be important. There's sort of variable amounts of bioturbation that might sort of homogenize the sediment, and also sort of variable amounts of carbonate cement in there as well, which again could act as local baffles to the flow. These are the heterogeneities we looked at. I've just talked through the plan view geometry of the delta, the deeper decliniforms, the continuity of cements sort of along the top of those three sort of wedge-shaped units of the delta building out. The vertical spacing of carbonate cements in between those, the lateral extent of carbonate cements, the extent of mud drapes, and the bioturbation intensity. So I said earlier that some of these we can sketch directly, but some of these, so for example, bioturbation or mud drape extent, well, we can't sketch a model which captures sort of kilometre scale and also millimetre scale. But these parameters in here, we can use effective properties, sort of KV/KH ratios, or different means to try and capture the amount of bioturbation. And again, we can do that to give us a low setting or a high setting. So just to say, these settings in here, the low and high ones, they draw on sort of their different output analogues. We have this sort of contrast in the extent and geometry of carbonate cements, for example, as well as the subsurface data, including from the overlying troll field reservoir. And in terms of the properties that we assign to those fascies, well, we take those from the data from the test well. And again, the data I'm talking about here, Equinor released it publicly, which is great. There's nothing like having free data around when you're scrabbling around to set up an MSc project with a week's notice. So definitely having publicly available data is good. And so these are the values of porosity. So basically the best quality fascies in here are essentially the upper, shallower parts of the deltaic sandstones. So these are some of the models that Will built. So here's one with a relatively simple shape to the delta building out sort of from east to west. Here's one with a more complex geometry, and the idea here is that there's strong sort of tidal and or wave generated currents that sort of, as the delta builds out, gets pushed down towards the south. And that's a model which has been developed sort of pretty well in the overlying troll field reservoir. And then we can look at whether we have a relatively small amount of interfingering between the fascies belts, so here, or whether we have a relatively large amount of fascies interfingering. And one aspect of that is it sort of controls the width of the sand bodies in a particular orientation. So in terms of the outputs we get from that set of models, well, here we're looking at effective horizontal permeability. So again, black is north-south, grey is west-east. And here's the vertical effective permeability. And one thing that stands out straight away from these tornado charts, we don't just have one key parameter standing out at the top and everything else sort of fading into insignificance. I mean, most of the parameters here have an influence which is, to some degree large. So in general, there's a set of parameters at the top here, so things like the plan view geometry for delta, the intensity of bioturbation, the dip of fasces into cliniforms, and the amount of fasces interfingering. So that planform geometry, the interfingering, the dip of the cliniforms, those three parameters sort of control the distribution and the connectivity of the best quality reservoir fasces. The bioturbation intensity, well, that's sort of some of the permeability anisotropy within the fasces. And then parameters that relate to carbonate cements. So that's particularly important for the vertical permeability, whether we have laterally continuous carbonate cements on top of some of these units, and the number and spacing of kind of smaller carbonate cements as represented using KV/KH ratios within the fasces. So pretty much most of the heterogeneity we looked at had some impact on either lateral or vertical effective permeability. If we then look at this sort of proxy for how long it takes one pore volume injected to sort of break through at the well, well, again, the tornado chart indicates that many of these parameters have a relatively significant impact. So the dip extent of the fasces interfingering across the cliniforms, the dip of the cliniforms, the planform geometry. So again, those three parameters pretty much control the distribution and connectivity of our best reservoir quality sands. So the lateral extent of carbonate cements, that's also important in terms of this sort of breakthrough proxy. And even down to here, so lateral continuity of carbonate cements kind of at a smaller scale in between the major carbonate cemented surfaces. And just to sort of give you an illustration of that, we're looking at sort of views here, looking down from above at the top of two of these models. So this model in here is basically one of these relatively simple sort of delta shapes that sort of bulge out towards the west in this model, as shown by the blue line in here. So on this column here is basically showing that the coloured regions are the fasces which are contacted by the injected fluid. And here we're basically looking at the time it takes, the time of flight of that fluid to reach a certain point. So blues are short time periods, reds are longer time periods. So you can see in this case, west to east, actually these values are slow, and there's a relatively kind of uniform sort of kind of sweep through this relatively simple geometry once the fluid has reached the front of the delta. In this case here, we're sort of injecting at the bottom of the south, injecting towards the north, and basically the fluid just shoots through much more rapidly through kind of elongated tongue. So this is a model with one of these more complex geometries. So you have this sort of continuous tongue of good quality sand in here, and as you might expect, all the injected fluids go through there really fast. So in that particular case, there's not a simple answer that falls out, and that suggests that actually that for future characterization, there's lots of things that should be characterized to some degree of detail. So just to sort of give you a few ideas about where this is going and where we're taking this now. So one, we're going back to the Bunter sandstone as a sort of as a case study example. But I mentioned before the idea of building models at different scales and linking them together. So in this case, in Jafar's work, he got down to this kind of scale, but there's plenty of heterogeneity at smaller scales we could characterize. And that's something that Shakamat is working on as part of his PhD. So here's the bottom is an outcrop face. You see the 5 meter scale bar there. The colors in here are different types of mainly sandy fasces, but characterized by differences in grain size and sedimentary structures. Within there, we can look at each of the individual fasces associations. So in other words, each of these colored kind of areas on the cliff face. And then even within there, we can look down to the scale of individual sedimentary structures that we can see at the outcrop and also in core as well. And just to sort of give you sort of one example of the smaller scale models that Shakamat's been building, Here's a picture from the outcrop of cross-bedded sandstone, and you might be able to see, if you've got good eyes, that we zoom into that we're looking at sort of the toe sets within a cross-bed, and there's some paler colours regions and sort of darker coloured regions. So we have some clean sandstone laminae, and we have some sandstone laminae with sort of dispersed clay in the matrix. And we think that dispersed clay has come from mud clasts that we've carried in the river, but as they've broken down and disaggregated, that clay ends up filling some of the pore space. So that's really sort of depositional breaking down of mud clasts. Here's a model based on that. In this case, this is a roughly simple geometry in the third dimension. It's just tabular cross bedding. So we sketch on the front face and just project backwards. And you can see the different sort of values of porosity and permeability assigned to these sort of clay poor and clay-rich sandstone laminae. And we can use this model to derive effective properties, KV, KH, KX, at this scale that we can then put into larger scale models. And these models, they're relatively quick to build. Now, this approach of hierarchy of different nested models is an idea that's been around for a long time, but the barrier to actually carrying that out has been the fact that it takes so long to build the models. So what we're looking at here is, on the vertical axis, is basically effective permeability but normalized. So from sort of the clay-rich sandstone to the clay-poor sandstone at the top. We're looking at effective permeability in 3 different orientations, and in this case, the horizontal axis here is basically looking at the grid cell dimensions and the resolution of the model. So the first step here is to recognize, okay, once we get to about this region in here, these curves they get close to flattening off. So that's the sort of the grid resolution that we need to capture those different laminae within the cross beds. The next thing we can do is look at sort of cutting down the volume of that model to recognize what's the representative element of that heterogeneity. Do we need to build a big model, or can we get away with building a smaller model which still captures the effects of that cross bedding and the clay distribution within the pore sets? So here we're looking at KX and KZ, and basically what you're seeing here is basically the very small models, so up to about this point in here, so that's basically about 150 centimeters. The value of the normalized permeability is variable. Once we get above that size, it's pretty flat. And we see a similar thing for the permeability in the Z direction. Down here, it varies, but once we get above a certain size, it stays flat. So that basically tells us that we need a model which is about the size of where those curves flatten out. So this is sort of work in progress, but the idea is to do this kind of approach for all the various fascies, put those into larger scale models and repeat the process. And then the next stage up will be the scale that we can represent explicitly in models of, if not the full storage unit, then pretty close to it. So the second thing is basically, if you want to use this really for CO2 storage, it's not good enough to just rely on tracer flow. I mean, that does give us a first order approximation, but we need to really think a bit more about representing viscous, gravity, and capillary forces. And there's a couple of ways we can approach that. So one of them is to basically look at numerical proxies for the ratio of the importance of, say, viscous and gravity forces. So sort of a computational gravity number. And we could do something similar for capillary forces as well. So what you're seeing here is a sort of an image of the flow simulation through this model again. Here's a well where we're injecting fluid, and the blue regions, they're basically characterized by low values of this computational gravity number, and they're regions where viscous forces dominate. And as we move into these red areas, so higher computational gravity numbers, then gravity forces become more important. So again, we're not sort of this is a prototyping kind of screening tool, but what this tells us is we can identify the regions of the reservoir where certain forces dominate, and from there sort of predict the impact on the fluid distributions and how long the fluids might stay there sort of baffled. The second thing you can do is, start to sort of bring in and work more on other kinds of computational modelling tools. So what you're looking at here are basically images from the Delft Advanced Research Terror Simulator, or DARTS. So this model is designed, again, it's been built up over a 10-year program by Dennis Voskov and his group at Delft, but it handles really complex sort of physical problems. So it's sort of ideal for multi-phase flow and looking at the impact of various forces. So here we're looking at sort of simulating CO2 movement through, in this case, a kind of a homogeneous block of rock. We have CO2 at the top, and basically we sort of let that evolve through time, and as CO2 sort of dissolves into that brine, it becomes more dense and sinks down. So after 50 years, this is a sort of model prediction of those dense sort of plumes, downward moving plumes of dense CO2-rich brine. Then after 1,000 years, you can see those plumes, they've moved a lot more. They've started to disperse and diffuse out into the brine, which doesn't contain lots of CO2. And there's lots of those plumes in here, but only a few of them grow into these big things over here. So you start to get some sort of interesting insights into the physical behaviour, but if we can capture that and couple it with complex geology, then we can really start to get a handle on these different trapping processes. Okay, so just to sort of finish up then, so what I've shown you is I hope that we have this fast screening method, and that it can be used sort of in short time periods by non-modelling specialists to get sort of useful results in terms of identifying heterogeneities which are likely to be important for CO2 baffling. 3 elements in there: the experimental design to cut down the number of models we look at, sort of sketch-based models, basically tools that allow us to build models quickly, and then flow diagnostics. So again, quick computational tools which allow us to sort of pull out sort of meaningful results in terms of flow. Although again, all at a kind of a screening level and a sort of prototyping level. And in terms of what's important, sort of pulling that out from those 2 case studies, well, there's probably nothing surprising in this, but still we're able to identify heterogeneities which control the distribution and connectivity of high permeability sandstones. So whether that's lenses or sheets of Aeolian sandstone, or whether that's the plan view geometry of the delta as it built out, and also the lateral extent, continuity, and vertical spacing of low permeability mudstones and cemented bodies. So again, no sort of surprises there, but these are likely to be important in terms of CO2 storage as well. Okay, so that's it. So thanks for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Mentioned your last slide, it looked like the capillaries consolidated into a few of them, the horizontal. Why is that?
These ones in here.
Yeah, one on the top left.
Okay, so what's happening here is that some of these plumes basically, some of them grow and they suck up. They basically, the CO2 kind of gets, once they start to form bigger, that kind of sucks the remaining CO2 into them. So basically, it's just kind of a self-organisation, really, that we start with lots of small features and we end up with larger ones. And I guess it's sort of an open question as to how much of that is, could we predict exactly where these are, or are they maybe say something about their spacing, but maybe not the precise location of them. Yeah.
Looking at the software with I'm famous Proxy rather than drawing these effectively geobodies by hand, would you be able to just import a geobody in the same sort of services sketch?
Yeah.
Not too detailed.
Yeah. No, we can. So I mean, we can import in different formats. And most of the effort we've spent on that has basically been on sort of Petrel, because essentially people are keen to take existing reservoir models and sort of play with them, or can add them, change geometries quickly. But yeah, I mean, for us, the fact that we can import things, as you say, so it's not. I mean, Sketches are great in terms of capturing concepts, but if you already have something a bit more quantitative and more data constrained, then yeah, we'd want to use that as well. Yeah. Yeah, Jane?
Right. So yeah, so in the Sherwood sandstone, you have the heterogeneities that you characterize, but they have a higher low setting. So where is the data from the Sherwood sandstone from, and how well do you know these higher
So those are good questions. So basically, because those models were designed to be quite generic, we took them from a range of different sources. So generally, the bigger scale features and values of porosity and permeability we took from the subsurface fields. So things like, you know, spacing of thickness of reservoir layers, lateral extent of some of the units, obviously values of porosity and permeability. Particularly at the smaller scale, though, you need to rely on outcrop data. So the extent and the spacing of the cemented units within the fluvial channel sandstones, I mean, that basically has to come from outcrop analogues. And equally, the sort of examples I showed with Shakowat's work, where we go even smaller scale, well, you know, the next calibration point really is the core. But once we, you know, but anything bigger than core scale and smaller than seismic scale, effectively you had to rely on outcrop analogues to a large extent. I should have said actually, so, and it's kind of in my face here, but you know, this rapid reservoir modeling software. So we have an open source version of that. So you're welcome to go and try that, and the website is there. So actually, this, yeah, I think I said at the beginning, tomorrow we have our first kind of group of students using this on an assessment. So we'll find out this time tomorrow quite how simple and easy it is to use by 20 non-specialists. You can see how my email traffic looks tomorrow, but yeah, so we're very kind of happy for people to use it and test it out, and obviously feedback is great as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you do the gridding step, because obviously from your sketch to then actually simulate, you have to do some kind of gridding.
Yeah.
So is it very simple gridding with like kind of constant style size, or and the gridding layers kind of follow just really well? So
I guess in terms of the sketch, the actual sketch itself, it's just surfaces. So for that, we don't need a grid. But as soon as you make a computation, as soon as you make a calculation, so that basically means the flow diagnostics part, then we need to have a grid to make that calculation. And you know, we have worked on other projects with more complicated grids, including some that sort of crawl along with the fluid front through time and sort of track changes in pressure and you know, saturations. They're great, but they're not computationally cheap. And you know, so here we use a very simple Cartesian grid. We can play around with the resolution to try and make sure we capture what we want to capture within that grid. But it also means it's very stable, fast, numerically simple. So I guess we have an aspiration to try and get back in the more complex gridding, but we did try that and sort of ran into kind of practical problems, and that, you know, so it's somewhere on the wish list, but it's not there yet.
Is there a limitation on the size of the number of grids that you get out to a million?
The limitation basically is the amount of memory that your PC has. Right. So you know, so say this afternoon, the students will have kind of laptops, and they're running it on that. And they basically had 100 grid cells in X, 100 grid cells in Y, and 100 grid cells in Z. And for that resolution, you know, the calculations run in sort of 2 to 3 seconds. Now, depending on how good your computer is, you can kind of add a bit more. Probably not an order of magnitude more before things start to become slow and potentially, you know, you just run out of memory. Yeah,
we have a question online from Ruth Hamilton. She's asking, does the software take into account the variation information fluids and possible interactions? For instance, highly saline versus highly saline formation fluids, and how does it deal with the CO2 phase?
Yeah, so at the moment it doesn't do any of those things. That is the short answer. So we just, you know, again, you know, one aspect of these flow diagnostics is to keep it, you know, this is any application of flow diagnostics, these simple calculations, they all kind of assume single phase flow. And that obviously is a big simplification, but it makes it does mean you can compute things fast. So the challenge there is to identify things which are useful to calculate in single phase flow as a proxy for more complicated physics. So that's sort of our approach here in terms of implementing it into the Sketchbased software. Or alternatively, it's basically to integrate more complex models that do handle those sort of physical and chemical effects. And I think both of those are valid. Both will pursue both of those, but they're the degree of effort required to use those will be different, and also the when and where you might apply them would also be different. So again, sort of models put to prototype as a basis to then go in and build more complicated models, including more complicated simulation models.
Gary, I just wanted to ask, in terms of time saving compared to the standard industry software, how does this compare? And then in terms of the modeling results, how does this compare?
Yeah, so in terms of time, the Sketchbased tool is really fast. I mean, basically, you can the most complex models that we've built. So Shakuat has built them. They maybe have 100 to 200 surfaces in. The software does start to become slow then, but it's still all relative. And depending on how complex the geometries are, you can start to run into problems there as well. But say, the models of cross-bedding that we showed there, Shakuat, what sort of time did it take you to sketch those?
30 minutes.
Sorry, 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Yeah, okay. So, and one thing here is basically, we want, this is true for any modelling project, you want people to think about the geology or the fluids. You don't want to be thinking about which button to press in the software. And this is kind of an aim toward, to step in that direction, I suppose. In terms of the computational results at the end, so we have benchmarked some of these against Petrel, for example, and the results are they're basically comparable within a few percent, basically. But again, that's just for kind of simple tracer flow. Yeah.
In your models, you have an injector and a producer. In the CO2 sequestration world, is that how it's going to be done? Or
Yeah, that is a good question. So basically, the reason we used an injection production well here was that was what the software we could implement the software at the time. We can now do more sophisticated things. We could inject over one face and sort of off-take over the other. So in terms of CO2 injection, that is in general not the plan. You might use an off-take well, say in a depleted oil and gas field where you're worried about pressure building up against sealing faults, for example. You might need to sort of bleed off some of the pressure to allow more pore space to get more CO2 in. So that probably will be the case in some applications. But say, big saline aquifer, you wouldn't want any off-take wells. You basically just want a handful of injector wells, widely spaced, and then you would just let the pressure dissipate away from those. So that kind of setup on here is kind of artificial, but we can now do some more sophisticated things in terms of well placements, a bit close to what will happen in reality.
Okay, if there is no more formal questions, I suggest we finalize the formal part with applause and then go to the informal part. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony.